Chapter 12. Devil's Bargain. That evening at 8:30, beautifully dressed, Dorian Gray came into Lady Narborough's drawing-room. He felt wildly excited, but he was smiling as easy and graceful as ever. Certainly no one looking at Dorian Gray that night could have an idea that he had passed through a tragedy. For a moment Dorian himself felt the terrible pleasure of a double life. It was a small party. Lady Narborough was a very clever woman, and Dorian was one of her favorites. She always told him that she was glad she had not met him in early life. "I know, my dear, I should have fallen madly in love with you," she used to say. Dorian said a graceful compliment and looked round the room. Yes, it was certainly a boring party, but when Dorian heard Henry's slow musical voice, he didn't feel bored any more. But at dinner, he could not eat anything. Plate after plate went away untasted. Now and then Lord Henry looked across at him, wondering at his silence. From time to time the servant filled his glass with champagne. He drank in a hurry, but his thirst grew. "Dorian," said Lord Henry at last, "what is the matter with you tonight? You are quite out of sorts." "I am quite well, Harry. I am tired, that is all." "You were charming last night. By the way, Dorian, you ran off very early last night. You left before 11. What did you do afterwards? Did you go straight home?" Dorian looked at him hurriedly. "No, Harry," he said at last. "I did not get home till nearly 3. "Did you go to the club?" "Yes," he answered. Then he bit his lip. "No, I don't mean that. I didn't go to the club. I walked about. I forget what I did. How curious you are, Harry. You always want to know what one has been doing." "I always want to forget what I have been doing. I came in at 2:30, if you wish to know the exact time. I had left my key at home, and my servant had to let me in. If you want any evidence on the subject, you can ask him." Lord Henry looked at him with surprise. "My dear fellow, something has happened to you, Dorian. Tell me what it is. You are not yourself tonight." "Don't mind me, Harry. I am out of temper. I shall come round and see you tomorrow or next day. Make my excuses to Lady Narborough. I shan't go upstairs. I shall go home. I must go home." "All right, Dorian. I hope to see you tomorrow at tea-time." "I will try to be there, Harry," he said, leaving the room. As he drove back to his own house, he felt that the sense of terror come back to him. Lord Henry's question had made him lose his nerves for the moment. Basil's things had to be destroyed. He was afraid. He hated the idea of even touching them, yet it had to be done. He realized that, and when he had locked the door of his library, he opened the secret place into which he had hidden Basil Hallward's coat and bag. A huge fire was burning in his room. The smell of the burning leather and cloth was horrible. It took him 3/4 of an hour to finish everything. At the end, he felt sick. Suddenly he started, and his eyes grew strangely bright. He wanted to forget everything for a while. He wanted to escape from the prison of life and to lose himself in the dreamland. In a moment he left the room and came into the bedroom. At midnight, Dorian Gray, dressed as a poor man, went out of his house. In Bond Street, he found a cab. The man shook his head. "It is too far for me," he said. "I'll pay you well," said Dorian. "All right, sir," answered the man. "You will be there in an hour." A cold rain began to fall, and the street lamps looked ghastly in it. The pubs were just closing, and men and women were standing in groups round their doors. From some of them came the sound of horrible laughter. Lying back in the cab, Dorian Gray watched the shame of the great city, and now and then he repeated to himself the words that Lord Henry had said to him on the first day they had met. To cure the soul by means of the senses, and the senses by means of the soul. Yes, that was the secret. He had often tried it, and would try it again now. There were opium dens where the memory of old sins could be destroyed by the madness of sins that were new. The moon hung low in the sky like a yellow skull. From time to time a huge ugly cloud stretched a long arm across and hid it. The gas lamps grew fewer, and the streets more narrow and gloomy. To cure the soul by means of the senses, and the senses by means of the soul. How the words rang in his ears. His soul certainly was sick to death. Was it true that the senses could cure it? What could help it? The forgiveness was impossible. Forgetfulness was possible still. Dorian wanted to forget what he had done. Indeed, what right had Basil to have spoken to him like that? Who had made him a judge over him? The cab was going more and more slowly. Dorian looked out and called to the man to drive faster. The dreadful hunger for opium grew inside. His throat burned and his delicate hands trembled nervously. The way seemed endless, and the streets looked like the black spiderweb. The monotony became unbearable, and as the mist thickened, he felt afraid. It is said that passion makes one think in a circle. He could think only about that Henry's phrase, to cure the soul by means of the senses, and the senses by means of the soul. He could feel nothing but the wild desire to live, most terrible of all man's appetites. Ugliness, that had once been hateful to him, because it made things real, became dear to him now for that very reason. Ugliness was the one reality. The dirty opium dens, the rude life, the thieves and criminals interested him more now than all the wonderful works of art. They were what he needed for forgetfulness. In 3 days, he would be free. In about 7 or 8 minutes, he reached a small dirty house. In one of the top windows stood a lamp. He stopped and gave a knock. After a little time, he heard steps in the passage, and the door opened quietly. He went in without saying a word. At the end of the hall, there was an old green curtain. He drew it away and entered a long, low room. It was rather dark and smelly. The floor was covered with brown dust. In one corner, with his head buried in his arms, a sailor sat at the table. 2 unpleasant women were laughing at an old man who was brushing his coat. "He thinks he's got red ants on him," laughed one of them as Dorian passed by. The man looked at her in terror and began to cry. At the end of the room there was a little staircase leading to a dark room. As Dorian hurried up its 3 steps, the heavy smell of opium met him. He made a deep breath with pleasure. When he entered, a young man with yellow hair looked up at him. "You here, Adrian?" said Dorian. "Where else should I be?" he answered. "None of my friends will speak to me now." "I thought you had left England." "As long as one has this thing, one doesn't want friends. I think I have had too many friends."